Good evening. Welcome to this virtual event examining the so-called deep state. I'm Mike German, a fellow with the Brennan Center's Liberty and National Security Program and your moderator for this evening's program. The Brennan Center for Justice is a nonpartisan law and policy institute affiliated with NYU Law School. The program is being produced in partnership with New York University's John Brandeis Center, which is dedicated to civil debate on politics, public policy, and other major issues facing our world. In his farewell address to the nation in 1961, President Dwight D. Eisenhower warned Americans about a powerful new threat to American democracy, a growing military-industrial complex that could gain total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, in every city, every state house, and every office of the federal government. By 1975, when Senator Frank Church led the first and last comprehensive examination of US intelligence agencies by the Congress, the CIA, the FBI, and the national security agencies, he warned, if a dictator ever took over, these agencies could enable it to impose total tyranny, and there would be no way to fight back. And just last year, President Donald Trump tweeted, "I am fighting the fake news, the deep state, the Democrats, and the few remaining Republicans in name only. We are winning big." Today, as the National Guard troops and militarized police, some without badges or insignia, are patrolling our nation's capital and many cities and towns across America, I'm grateful to have David Rohde, a distinguished and courageous global reporter, executive editor of NewYorker.com, two-time Pulitzer Prize winner, and most recently author of In Deep, the FBI, the CIA, and the Truth About America's Deep State, here to help us sort it all out. The book examines the concept and term, the deep state, and what it means to people with different political perspectives. Welcome, David Rohde.
Hi, thank you so much, Mike. I'll do my best tonight, but I'm not sure I have all the answers.
Great. Well, before jumping in, I want to invite those listening to share your questions for our guest. Type them into the Q&A box, and we'll take as many as we can during the program and at the end of the program. David, is there a difference between the military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower warned us about and the deep state that Donald Trump and his supporters talk about?
I think there is, and the book was sort of it was an effort to get a better handle on the language we use to talk about, I'd say a more neutral term might be the permanent government. In the book, I talk about the institutional government. This would be the people who work in these institutions that outlast, every president we've had and that serve decade after decade. Liberals tend to invoke the Eisenhower term, the military-industrial complex, and that would be a fear of, generals, defense contractors, and intelligence operatives that seem to drive the United States into war after war. The modern-day sort of conservative term that Trump supporters use, obviously is a deep state, but I think a more accurate term is the administrative state. And that's a conservative fear of an ever-growing federal government that's constantly encroaching in, our lives and taking away our personal liberties. So widespread fear of the federal government, but I think it's seen in different ways by people on the right and the left.
The Church Committee, whose chief counsel, Fritz Schwartz, I'm proud to call a colleague here at the Brennan Center, documented myriad abuses by the intelligence community, including grand-scale programs like the NSA's operation to read every international telegram sent to and from Americans, CIA assassination plots, FBI dirty tricks like writing anonymous letters designed to break up the marriages of civil rights and anti-war protesters. Is that kind of abuse fodder for conspiracy theorists?
No, I mean, it absolutely happened. And I want to thank the Brennan Center and Fritz Schwartz, who let me interview him for the book. It's real. And the work of the Church Committee, I thought, was tremendous. It was kind of you to talk about it as sort of the last serious and effective look at what's gone wrong in the intelligence community. I mean, Frank, Fritz talked about, expecting when he interviewed FBI and CIA members, he thought he would like he'd sort of identify more with the CIA officers. Him, he's just lovely, but he, just for the audience, Fritz's middle initials are AO, so his initials are FAO Schwartz. He's a member of the famous family with the famous toy store. He went to Harvard, and so in the mid 70s, many CIA officials were, he says it himself, sort of elite Ivy Leaguers. And instead of being able to identify with the CIA officers, he was, Fritz was sort of horrified at how effective they were at lying. Bill Colby, the former head of the CIA, he would sit there and testify, and it was impossible to sort of catch him in a lie. He was so effective at it. And then Fritz told me that he actually liked more the FBI agents. He was more troubled by their behavior, what you talked about, smearing, civil rights leaders, Martin Luther King in particular, interfering and infiltrating with anti-war groups during Vietnam. But he felt like the FBI agents were more human. They tended to be, they went to, he said, sort of Fordham University and weren't, so elitist. But what troubled him was that the FBI agents rationalized their actions by saying they needed to do it to defend the country, that the laws weren't strong enough, to stop communism from infiltrating and undermining and destroying American society. And you know more, and I want you to talk, Mike, about your own time in the Bureau. When you start rationalizing improper and illegal activity, it's very, very dangerous for democracy.
And it's interesting because obviously the Church Committee recommended a number of reforms, many of which were instituted, but slowly over time and then rapidly after 9/11, many of those were weakened, if not removed. And you cite in the book a 2018 Monmouth poll that suggests that 8 out of 10 Americans believe that the government is monitoring them in some way. And since Edward Snowden's leaks, NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden's leaks proved, in fact, there was good reason for that. And you have to wonder whether the other two of that 8 out of 10 maybe you haven't been paying attention. How does that kind of mass surveillance impact our democracy and how the public views the intelligence community?
Yeah, you're right. So the numbers were very high in that poll. And what was interesting, too, was that there were two groups of Americans that were most worried about surveillance and two groups that were most likely to believe there was a deep state. On one side, politically, was NRA members. NRA members were afraid of the government, obviously, to come take their weapons away. But the other group that most feared the government, and this makes sense given the tragic events in the United States in the last few weeks, were racial minorities, that they would fear surveillance and law enforcement abuses. And obviously that's the product of decades of horrible criminal justice violations and abuses that, continued with the murder of George Floyd. So the point being, for people in the establishment, and I very much consider myself an establishment journalist. I worked at the New York Times for years. I worked at Reuters. I'm now at the New Yorker. People can dismiss Donald Trump, but the suspicion and the lack of trust in government is going to outlast him. He takes advantage of it. But I think academics, journalists, politicians all need to take a hard look at how we're, conducting our work and ourselves and ask why so many Americans distrust us. And it's getting worse, and it's not going to go away after Donald Trump leaves office.
And it is sort of a fascinating issue where you have so much skepticism and concern about the scope of the intelligence community being discussed both by Trump conservatives and Republicans and liberals who were part of the anti-war movement or concerned about these racial justice issues, and yet trying to move any reform of these policies, even as the Democrats were impeaching President Trump, they were voting to extend the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act and Patriot Act and reauthorize the Patriot Act. What is it about that establishment that somehow it's odd, right? I mean, sometimes it views itself as a target of these groups, but otherwise it wants to empower those agencies.
Well, I think it's we're sort of it seems, or I would hope, at the end of the 9/11 era. And I think there was sort of a mainstream Democrat and a mainstream Republican political calculation to be tough on national security, to vote for surveillance to protect yourself if there was a major attack in the United States politically. I think that's changed. You mentioned these strange bedfellows. There's an alliance between Ron Wyden, the very conservative, very liberal senator from Oregon, and Rand Paul, the conservative and libertarian Republican senator from Kentucky, against surveillance. Justin Amash, the Republican turned independent, the same thing. So oddly, this is one of the areas where there is political agreement in this really polarized time. And the crazy thing is, we more of our personal information is available than ever to be surveilled by the government. It's accelerating by the year, and we just have no political consensus, no laws, no regulation, no rules of the road for what the government can collect. When can the FBI break into an Apple iPhone if it's used in a crime? And beyond that, and I don't mean to digress, I've talked to NSA officials that say the biggest collectors of information in the country are private tech companies, that Facebook and Google, and Twitter have more information about us, or soon will have more information about us than even the government. And how are we regulating that? So lastly, I see that as an opportunity. There is a way for people on the right and the left to demand privacy and demand better controls over the government and corporations.
And in the end, we'll get to some recommendations as far as reforms are concerned. But you start the book with the story of a whistleblower, which of course is close to my heart as an FBI whistleblower. And it's interesting how that changes your perspective, because obviously when I joined the FBI, I gave them carte blanche to go through my background and to continue going through my background throughout my FBI career. And did that voluntarily, wanted them to make sure that they knew I was squeaky clean, until I blew the whistle on internal misconduct, and I realized how that information could all be weaponized to discredit me as a whistleblower. So when you're a reporter working on national security, how difficult is it to talk to people within these institutions who can give you the down low on what's really happening?
It might be easy for other reporters. It's very difficult, and I think we're going to talk about this goes beyond President Trump, but President Trump has effectively silenced, I think, many people at all levels of the intelligence community. The attacks, the public attacks on Dan Coats, the director of national intelligence, when he said North Korea wasn't interested in making a nuclear deal with Donald Trump. Trump ridiculing him, Trump eventually, removing Coats as director of national intelligence, has a chilling effect. Gina Haspel, the CIA director, Chris Wray, the FBI director, they all try to minimize their public appearances, their testimony before Congress, because they know members of Congress or members of the press, if they give a speech, are going to try to get them to say something that contradicts a claim by the president, and then the president will be furious at them and attack them. And though that message, the firing of officials who challenge Trump, the firing of officials who investigate Trump, declaring the people that conducted the Trump-Russia investigation, which was not perfect, but declaring those, people human scum, is a warning, and it has had a chilling effect. Having John Durham investigate the Trump-Russia investigation, and I think it's proper to investigate it. I'd rather have a nonpartisan commission, maybe, or if there could ever be a church committee. I don't think we can have that kind of bipartisan effort. Would be more effective. But this is, really serious. You have a criminal investigation of CIA analysts, their judgments about Russia's interference, and a criminal investigation of FBI agents that, has succeeded, and people aren't talking.
And I think that raises a very difficult point, right? I mean, if it clearly we don't want to criminalize poor analysis or some minor mistakes in preparing an affidavit or something like that. But at the same time, back in the 70s when there was this reform effort, Richard Helms, the CIA director, was charged with lying to Congress when he didn't tell the truth. The FBI director was charged with a crime, Patrick Gray. other FBI officials, high-ranking officials, were charged with authorizing black bag jobs, illegal searches. And there was, it seemed that there was going to be some accountability, but more recently, you've seen instances where numerous intelligence agency officials have made statements that were, if not false, certainly misrepresented the truth, and yet there was no accountability. The worst abuse that we could imagine a government to do, torture, and then the attempts to cover up that torture and mischaracterize the effectiveness of that tactic. How do we hold these agencies accountable without having some kind of legal result?
It's a huge question, and we're not, and that's, you know, one of the things that we have to sort of face. It was amazing what happened in the 70s. Mark Felt was one of the FBI officials you mentioned, and L. Patrick Gray. They were convicted at trial in a federal court by a jury of their peers of violating the civil rights of Americans. 3 senior FBI officials. Mark Felt, as many people may know, was at the same time Deep Throat, the source, you know, for the Washington Post for Bernstein and Woodward in terms of Watergate. But one thing that happens after those convictions is that Ronald Reagan becomes president, and one of the first things he does is he pardons L. Patrick Gray and Mark Felt and others who were convicted in those trials, and says they were patriotic Americans. And I digress a bit here, but there's an emergence of a belief that the presidency had been weakened too much. The FBI was being limited in its you know, efforts to defend the country from communism. And, you know, we can talk about this later, but one of the young adherents who's a member of the Reagan administration is Bill Barr, the current Attorney General of the United States. And it's a belief that's existed for quite a while on the conservative side, and Bill Barr, I think, sincerely believes it, that this new methods of oversight, the House and Senate Intelligence Committees, the FISA court, you know, are infringements on the executive branch's ability to protect the country and to carry out investigations. And that's, you know, a separate danger where they're essentially saying, let the president oversee and decide who's acting improperly and who's not. I would prefer to see the various branches doing it. But you're right in that Jim Clapper, you know, he was a character in the book. He talked to me extensively. His famous statement, you know, when asked the question by Senator Wyden, Clapper, you know, told me he misspoke. He, you know, misunderstood the question. I know many people don't buy that. Said he was, you know, committed perjury and lied. And there is a problem, the torture report not being made public. I think it's partisanship. I think there's a sense of each political party to protect their president. President Obama didn't want to make the torture report public, and Democrats backed him on that. And so I think that, you know, when we get in our partisan camps, it allows intelligence officials to get away with things that they didn't as much in the past.
And also shape the story in a way, because they have more freedom to speak to the press. And it's often hard because others in the agency can't. You know, one of the excuses or justifications, to be a little nicer, that a lot of the people in the post 9/11 era will talk about is, and you talked to Joan Dempsey, a deputy director at CIA, who's justified the bad analysis in Iraq weapons of mass destruction by saying, you know, we didn't want to underestimate the threat again as with Al-Qaeda. She didn't say that part, but since it was right in the aftermath of that, I understand that that's where they were coming from. But doesn't that, but that often doesn't reflect the amount of dissent within the agencies, right? There were dissenting opinions to that intelligence, and yet when the people who can speak to the press can shape the story as, you know, we were well-meaning people. And I agree, they were probably all very well-meaning people, but the idea that there weren't people trying to dismantle the church committee reforms, that was their goal from the beginning, even stated. James Baker, the former Bush chief of staff, actually said that, that blamed the church committee reforms for the 9/11 failures. So as a reporter, how difficult is that to try to take what they say because they're the ones willing to talk to you, but try to figure out where the truth actually lies?
Look, it's very difficult, and you've got very few people willing to talk. I found that, like the Horowitz report, the Inspector General's report on what was wrong in the FBI investigation, that some of the improper things, the improper surveillance for a certain period at Carter Page was very valuable. For that investigation and for congressional hearings, officials are under oath. They lie. They lied to Congress. Bill Casey lied to Congress repeatedly. But you're sort of trying to triangulate. But I'll be honest that it's more and more difficult. And this, I think, goes back to the partisanship. There's such a sort of sense of point scoring that I got the sense, and Joan Dempsey, talked to her for the book, that this feeling that intelligence officials sort of adopt the worst case scenario. They say there's WMD in Iraq and they're wrong, because they're so afraid of sort of partisan payback that there'll be an exaggerated investigation, and simple mistakes will get you in trouble. So don't make any big ones, or you're doomed. But I do think there's a problem of accountability that's happening. I think that, and one last thing is, a lot of these officials also admitted that the blanket secrecy that's always existed, but that was expanded sort of post 9/11, backfired. It's a perfect example. So they talked about the Snowden revelations. Again, the church reforms, there was the creation of the FISA court. There would be judges that should approve eavesdropping and these different programs that went on. And, again, they very well could have been lying to me, but I had many, many intelligence officials, NSA officials, Justice Department officials, FBI officials say they were surprised by the outcry that followed the Snowden revelations, because everything was, quote unquote, done legally. The Obama administration, unlike the Bush administration, did go to the FISA court and ask FISA court judges to approve the collection they were doing. And they thought that was enough. And, they all admitted to me that they misjudged how much suspicion there was among Americans, and that they shouldn't have been so secret about it. There was so much political support after 9/11 for surveillance and protecting the country. They could have gotten, legal mandates to do everything they did that they did in secret. I'm a journalist, and we could talk more about this, but more transparency, the better. Secrecy, I think, leads to abuses.
And you mentioned that one of the people you spoke to is James Clapper, and he has an interesting career because it's so lengthy, multiple decades, I think more than 40 years in the intelligence community. He's interesting, both because of his early beginnings in the agency and later on. I think it's telling where he actually resented the church committee investigation and the new controls that were putting on, because he had a deep-seated belief that intelligence officials would do the right thing. That this being convinced of their own morality, for lack of a better word, but their own interest in following the law. But there was something that he said that you quoted that I thought made it jump out, where he was talking about that time period and the excesses of the targeting the civil rights community, for example. And he said that, that there was fear that there was insurrection. And he said that he was genuinely frightened about what was happening in the country because of the rioting and other civil unrest. And rather than looking at it from somebody else's perspective, that the fear was the COINTELPRO programs, the government spying and police unaccountability with their violence against these communities. And particularly as we're facing the challenges we're now facing, we still have an intelligence community that's overwhelmingly white. The FBI is more than 83% white, still more than 80% male. And how that perspective makes what they look at as a threat different. You know, not just political, but just built into our social economic system.
Yeah, no, it's similar to the mentality that can happen to with some, you know, police officers and who you see as a threat. It's Clapper. I used this term earlier, institutional government, and we talked about this earlier. Look, there are bad journalists who like exaggerate stories. There are bad police officers who carry out abusive things. My brother used to be a police officer, and my brother-in-law as well. There's bad intelligence operatives who, you know, enjoy torturing people. But what's interesting to me, and I think more dangerous, and you may know more than me, is the way someone will rationalize, you know, the actions that they're taking. So I use that term institutional government, and that was sort of the idea that, you know, everyone's got political biases, but a lot of these career people, their loyalty is to their institution. They're going to trust their institution. They're going to defend their institution. They're going to want it to get a bigger budget. You know, they're going to want it to win a turf battle against another government agency. And Jim Clapper's father was an Army signal intelligence officer who, you know, bravely, you know, fought in World War II, and that I still see as many people see as a just cause. And he grew up around, his father then worked for the NSA. And so he grew up in this world. He did see the institution as honorable. It's just like you said, he thought folks would do the right thing. But you're right. He talked about seeing Washington burning during the riots that were happening in the late 60s. And we just had Washington burning. And, you know, the President of the United States calling for active duty troops being, you know, sent out along with the National Guard. And we can talk more about the present, but so how do you have systems and guidelines that prevent those abuses, whether they're intentional corrupt abuses and based on people's racial or religious biases, or people who rationalize that they have to take these steps to defend the country? And I think the answer is more transparency, more oversight, competing oversight, congressional oversight, judicial oversight, more access for the press, of course. But that's human nature, and these are extraordinarily powerful agencies, and it's human nature to rationalize that you and your peers are doing the right thing.
And it's also interesting with Clapper because he was involved in the faulty analysis that justified the Iraq War, and yet when Obama interviewed him for the director of national intelligence position, he saw him as somebody who was willing to speak truth to power. Where here, if you looked at his record, he wasn't one challenging the conventional Bush administration view that a war in Iraq was necessary.
Yeah, he you know, and there may be people watching this who know more than I do. He talked about, you know, a critical process failure in the curveball, the critical, you know, source of the intelligence about Iraq WMD, that the analysts in the intelligence community never knew the identity of curveball. And he and Joan Dempsey were very much like, we made a mistake. Joan Dempsey said we were so worried about another 9/11 that we leaned so far forward that we fell, you know, flat on our faces. But should there be punishment for that? You know, would the system be reformed? You know, Clapper said it is. And then today, kind of with the Trump effect, you know, Clapper says, I speak truth to power. You know, I did, he says. You know, and now intelligence chiefs who do speak truth to power are punished and publicly humiliated and fired. And, you know, Clapper said you know, Donald Trump is waging a war on fact, and that endangers us all. And so, yes, you know, he admitted his mistakes, has a long history. And, you know, I'll be frank, I was grateful that he talked to me
for
the book. But, you know, there's been multiple mistakes made by the intelligence community, you know, regularly. It's part of the business, and 9/11, you know, catastrophically.
Right. And again, you know, of course, Clapper was the one who, when Senator Wyden asked him a pretty direct question about whether the NSA had any programs that were gathering the records of millions of Americans, and he said no, not wittingly. And later said that he felt that was the least untruthful thing he could say, even though it was completely untruthful. So, and again, in undermining the public trust in these agencies, how much damage does that do, particularly when these officials, whether it's former CIA Director John Brennan, who was involved with the torture program and later the cover-up of that program, ordering the CIA to investigate the Senate staffers who were investigating the program, and then denying it. Who can the public trust from this field to tell them the truth and to not shade it, either because they're just so committed to the mission that they are not allowed to see contrary facts, or because they have some political perspective that they want to push?
I think the public, has to triangulate. I could joke, of course, they should trust journalists or FBI whistleblowers. Everybody kind of has an agenda. I would say broadly that part of the problem is back to this overclassification. Everything is secret. And one of my worries about the book was sort of going too easy on these institutions and these officials. They told me when they testify before Congress, they feel like members of Congress ask them to kind of talk about classified information or put them in a box to score political points. They know they can't answer the questions. One other character is, a former CIA officer, Will Hurd, who's now a Republican congressman, from Texas. Hurd, left the agency. He joined just before 9/11, served in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and then he's ambitious and ran for Congress and won, and then served on the Intelligence Committee. He was shocked at sort of the lack of understanding of some members of the Intelligence Committee of Congress of what the intelligence agencies were doing. Clearly, these agencies try to manage the oversight committees, and they probably do it very effectively given the size and of these committees and the staff that they have. They do have subpoena powers that, that's more power. The American system for overseeing its intelligence agencies is more aggressive than, many other Western democracies have, that we have judges and members of the legislative branch with subpoena power, is helpful, but it's not working as well as it did back in the church reform days. And then Hurd, he ended up, voting against the president's impeachment. He thought that Trump's call with Ukraine was amateurish and it was an improper, to withhold U.S. funding to that country. But he just didn't feel it was enough to remove a president from office. And so I'll go back to kind of blanket secrecy, blanket partisanship, the concentration of power, this push for no oversight of these agencies except for by the president, the kind of Bill Barr executive power approach. Things are really bad now. They're just going to get worse if we just give the president the power to classify whatever the president wants and to oversee these agencies on his own.
And I think Representative Hurd makes an interesting point about the lack of understanding of how intelligence programs work among the overseers of those programs. And you can imagine, as a member of Congress who has to get elected, who has a number of other concerns, constituents calling in, wanting to get things done, the ability to really understand what these agencies are doing is very difficult, particularly when the people who come to brief them, including the heads of these agencies, often don't know the truth, right? With the foreign intelligence surveillance, perfect example is James Baker, not the one who was chief of staff to the first President Bush, but the one who served in the Justice Department for decades and later FBI chief counsel. You talk about his role in the book, where he is the head of the Office of Intelligence Policy and Review, and that's the office that vets the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act applications that the FBI presents to the, and then the OIPR presents them to the court. So if anybody knows how FISA is being used, you would think he would be the one. So if he is briefing the court, and yet, as you write, he didn't know about this side program that when I was working at the ACLU, we called the Warrantless Wiretapping program. But frankly, probably not many people in the Justice Department knew about that program.
Yeah, Jim Baker told me that he was a few weeks after 9/11. He was out in front of the Justice Department, and a colleague from the FBI, an internal whistleblower, came up to him and said something spooky's going on. And he noticed in the FISA court applications there was these sort of news sources of information that didn't make sense. And then right up to the present, so this debate about surveillance and surveillance of the Trump campaign. Baker was the general counsel of the FBI as they were putting in the applications to surveil Carter Page. What came out as part of the Horowitz report was that there was a low-level FBI lawyer who had an email that said that Carter Page attracted the interest of the FBI because he was meeting with Russian officials. Baker, Comey didn't speak to me, but Baker said, they had these reports. First of all, the Russians hacked the DNC, leaked the emails. They had reports of the Russians, offering information to Papadopoulos, the aide. And then they had Carter Page meeting with these Russian officials. A low-level FBI lawyer changed the meaning of an email. The email said that Carter Page was telling the CIA about these meetings with Russian officials. He was cooperating with that. The lawyer reversed the meaning of that email and said that Carter Page was not telling the CIA about these meetings. And then the FISA application went forward. Baker, the general counsel of the FBI, said he had no idea that Carter Page was cooperating with the CIA. It's exactly what you said, people at the top not knowing all the information, all this compartmentalization, all this secrecy. And Carter Page was, Horowitz, I think half of the time he was surveilled properly. I think 4 of the 8 months, but the last 4 of the 8 months was illegal. That shouldn't have happened. That's outrageous. And sorry, my last thing, that is not the equivalent, though, of a coup against President Trump. There's problems in the system, but I just consistently found that President Trump exaggerated what was done to his campaign and the danger that he was describing. But that's a separate point. But abuses happen, and it's wrong what happened to Carter Page. It's wrong.
Right, and it was interesting when President Trump nominated Bill Barr to be Attorney General. Of course, this was after Jeff Sessions was fired, and there were a lot of people who were very concerned about Jeff Sessions' record and his performance as a prosecutor and then as a senator. And a lot of people on both sides of the political spectrum felt that Bill Barr was an institutionalist, that he was somebody who was going to protect the interests of the Justice Department. And that's sort of what this deep state idea is, right? That there is people who are protecting the institution rather than protecting the mission of the institution to serve the public. But he turns out not to have been devoted to that same maintenance of the rule of law. What is different about the way Bill Barr is responding in the current moment?
I think his loyalties to the executive branch and the need for a strong presidency. He gave a speech to the Federalist Society last fall, and he talked about, in his view, that of the 3 branches of government, the branch that performed the best and that was the most important for maintaining the safety of the country, the stability of the country, was the presidency. And he's talked about the Watergate reforms and the church reforms limiting the president's power. He complained about a federal immigration judge, blocking Trump's travel ban, somewhere on the West Coast, and that was an infringement on a president's power. That the Mueller investigation, this whole belief that there shouldn't be special counsels, another reform from the 70s that, Barr and others see as an infringement of the presidency. And Barr argued that in a moment of a pandemic, a Great Depression, war, the presidency is the only branch that can act rapidly and effectively to try to aid the country. And that's why, President Trump should not have to answer congressional subpoenas that are seen as, politically charged and just trying to slow down his efforts to execute his policies. To me, that's extraordinarily dangerous. Given this mess, given the digital era, given all the surveillance, given people rationalizing their actions, the last thing we want to do is concentrate power in one branch of the government. And I think it's important to say that's true for a Democratic president or a Republican one.
And this concern of the deep state, President Obama came into office after campaigning that he was going to get us out of Iraq and Afghanistan, that he was going to close Guantanamo Bay, that he was going to end torture, and wasn't very successful in that regard. How much power does the agency have? One of the fascinating people who's not mentioned in the book is General Mattis, who now is criticizing President Trump, but left his role as head of the Department of Defense because Trump pulled out of Syria or demanded a pull out of Syria, and that was what caused him to believe that this isn't the administration he wants to serve. How with a Justice Department of questionable integrity, is it possible to bring reform to these agencies?
I think not in a politically polarized, era like this, where there's no consensus like there emerged in the church era, and that's dangerous for everybody. This constant, point scoring and is really dangerous. And you mentioned Obama, he felt that generals, every president that's come in has felt like the bureaucracy was resisting him. Reagan thought the State Department was too soft on communism. Obama thought that Pentagon generals were leaking possible troop increase numbers in Afghanistan to box him into sending more troops than he wanted to. But no president has, said that a coup was being carried out by these government agencies. And I think that, Barr is particularly dangerous because, he's politicizing everything. Just in the last week, he defended the president's photo opportunity in front of St. John's Church, which former officials, including Mattis, was questioning. He's, as Attorney General, he's sort of spun the Mueller report. And I think that this kind of Darwinian world, and this is sort of, I was told, Trump's worldview, he doesn't think, journalists are trying to get it roughly right. And I know many people don't think many are, but Donald Trump's worldview, according to aides I've spoken to who worked with him, is that everyone is kind of biased and spinning. Donald Trump's a product of the, super competitive New York real estate world. So everybody exaggerates a bit, in their own interests. And if you don't, I guess people should be skeptical, but if there's just deep cynicism about government officials, if you don't trust Tony Fauci's, public health guidelines, it's very hard to kind of govern the country or come up with policies that can help all of us. So my other little mantra is, be skeptical, but don't be cynical. But it's just a very hard thing. How do you have a military that you control? How do you have an intelligence agency that you control in a democracy? And I think we're at the worst level of controlling them that we've been at in decades.
Ed, we've been getting a lot of questions, so I want to try to get to some of them. It was mentioned that racial minorities are distrustful of government, more likely to be distrustful of government. And here we are in a time where, because of the coronavirus, there are many programs being developed to do contact tracing, to gather information about people's movements and their contacts, who they've been, where they've been. How can a program like that be successful if there's so much distrust in what the government might do with that data? Or can it be?
I understand the suspicions. I guess it's I think that trafficking in conspiracy theories that particularly President Trump has engaged in, limits are there are some things we have to agree on as a society that we're going to, trust each other on. I could mention vaccinations and people will disagree with me. Public education, right. What should a basic curriculum be? What's American history? We're going to, we have to agree on these basic things and have some level of trust. We have to believe that there are some public officials, and I would think this was you, Mike, in your time in the Bureau, trying to do the right thing, trying to be public service. Trump's view of everybody having an angle and everybody being biased, there have to be some journalists who try to stick to the facts. I'm trying to do that, here, and probably failing. But
Right.
so I would ask people to trust, a contact tracing program. That's ridiculous. I'm a middle-aged white guy asking, racial minorities, what African Americans have been through, what Hispanics have been through, in terms of that right now with immigration crackdowns. I can understand why they wouldn't want to participate, but we will not function as a society, let alone a democracy, if we can't, share basic facts for the census, for voting. And I think some folks want us to not trust and stop voting and stop participating, because that helps them achieve their agendas as well.
And there's a question about how you would feel about term limits placed on intelligence officials, because it's fascinating. People like Jim Clapper or James Baker, Bill Barr are not only in these positions for so long, but also when they go out of these positions, they go into government contractors who contract back to the very agency that they left, and it creates a revolving door that, again, both creates real problems and fodder for conspiracy theorists who want to see a overarching conspiracy against their interests. Is there a way to curb that?
There could be term limits. This is a great question. The questioner's got me. I don't know how well, actually, there is term limits again, and I will go back and I will praise the church reforms for all that they did. A very simple term limit was a 10-year term for the FBI director, that after, nearly a half century of J. Edgar Hoover consolidating power and, blackmailing politicians and worse, abusing American civil rights, that was an ideal that was created. As we know, that hasn't quite worked out. You've got presidents firing FBI directors because they don't like what they're doing. But I think there could be, some situation like that. Currently, CIA directors are generally changing, with presidents when they come in, and it's more political, the appointments. I think that idea of an independent FBI director with a 10-year term limit, has been worn down, and it should be taken more seriously. And I think that's a good recommendation, to limit the limits. To limit how long these officials can serve there. Just a last thing again on the silencing that's going on. One thing that Trump did was he talked about pulling John Brennan's security clearance very early in the administration, when Brennan started tweeting these attacks at the president. I had a very hard time getting intelligence officials to talk to me, both current and former, because taking away that security clearance meant they would lose their jobs with, contractors after they had left, the agency. And this again shows the problem. Maybe you could argue low pay, or so everyone's trying to cash in after they serve as a lower paid public servant. But there's economic leverage that President Trump used to intimidate people into not speaking out.
And so I'm combining two questions here from the audience, but they ask about the connection between private companies like Facebook and telecom companies that are involved in the intelligence process, right? That's
Palantir.
Partnership, Palantir,
yeah,
that are partnering with the government in these programs. Both, how does that create a problem? And Congress has a hard enough time understanding the intelligence programs. How do they understand how these private companies are operating and how the two mix together? Or what would you recommend for them? I'm sure as a reporter you run into the same thing, right? You're trying to write a story on some secretive technology that might be abused. How do you get the information that you need to write the story?
You're reluctant, you're reliant on the senior officials who can talk to the press, not the mid-level officials, as you pointed out. You're relying on members of Congress from both parties who are going to want to, leak and frankly attack the current administration, the opposing party, and say they're doing a bad job on, looking at these contracts. And again, this is this problem where the size of the staffs on the oversight committees are, a joke. The intelligence committees are seen as, better platforms for being able to do TV hits on, Fox or CNN or MSNBC than in terms of performing oversight. And farming out so much of this to the private sector, you just end up, I think, this is really hard. I don't want to argue for some big government full of lifelong officials, but I do think you need a kind of strong, well-paid, kind of professional government workforce that's overseen by inspectors general. Again, Trump's fired a bunch of inspectors general, but independent people, this 70s system, for wrongdoing. There are ambitious, prosecutors around the country who would want to prosecute a contractor or a contracting firm that was, gouging the government. And then more transparency for journalists, for the Brennan Center, for watchdog groups to know more about these contracts and how they work. There's just way too much secrecy now. So like a dispersal of power, and then more transparency and lots of oversight with people competing against each other, where I boost my career as a journalist, or I boost my career as a member of Congress if I expose Palantir's, wrongdoing.
Right. And of course, part of the problem that I'm sure your source had is that the whistleblower protections that exist on paper are not very effective in reality. And we certainly saw this with the Ukraine whistleblower in the Trump administration. But it was fascinating to me to watch these members of Congress plead with the Trump administration to not retaliate against the whistleblowers when they were the ones that failed to write stronger protections into the law that could be used to protect those whistleblowers themselves.
Yeah, Senator Grassley, the champion of whistleblowers, and and to be on the same from mainstream Democrats as well.
Right.
Meaning that if there were whistleblowers that were attacking the Obama administration, that they weren't standing up for the whistleblowers. So I agree with you, and there aren't enough protections. And in the digital age, also, the identity of the Ukraine whistleblower being quickly posted online and doxing and everything else. I go back to my hyper-partisanship is the problem. Whistleblowers should be protected by, people from both parties. They should be rewarded for doing that politically by voters. So whistleblowers are critical.
And that's really difficult, right? I mean, the Bush administration got in trouble because they were hiring loyal Bushies to fill roles within the Justice Department rather than going through the normal professional procedure of getting the best candidates. But when the Obama administration comes in, how do you correct that politicization of the Justice Department without it being at least perceived as a repolitization from a different angle? And then when the next administration comes, it creates a seesawing effect, which is why it was so dangerous in the first place.
Yeah. I mean, I would first say in one area I would completely agree with Trump and Trump supporters. I think that, presidents and members of Congress every 2 to 4, 6 years get a Democratic mandate. And if they win an election and it's a fair and transparent election, government officials should do what the democratically elected representatives say, if the orders are legal and ethical. And if we get into, there was people kind of cheering, career government officials who wouldn't carry out orders in the beginning of the Trump administration. I think that's wrong and very dangerous, because the opposite thing can happen when, if a Democrat comes in. The U.S. system is different. I mean, there's about 3,000 appointees that every president brings in. You talked about the Justice Department. In Europe and in the UK, there's only a few dozen. There's essentially a minister who's, put in charge of the Ministry of Justice, and the rest are career government officials. I think that's about the right balance. Again, what do you want? All partisan political appointees, which we had in the 1800s, and that was abolished because the idea was to have a merit-based, government service, that people who, whose loyalties were towards the institution and doing the right thing were better than having pure partisans come in. Again, some of the current Trump administration officials at the Office of Personnel Management, again, that's another kind of 70s era reform that was supposed to create an apolitical and effective class of government workers. Some officials argue that there should be partisan employment, that all of the roughly 3 million civilians who work for the federal government should be appointed by the president every 4 years. I think that's a disaster. I don't want the president choosing every FBI agent and rewarding political loyalists. So I keep coming back to like the middle ground guy here who's like
Right.
competition, disperse the power, and transparency. We have to have some career government officials who feel and try to act in the public interest that are not partisans.
And it's interesting because the effort to make the FBI director nonpartisan, you mentioned, was creating a 10-year term, and yet even when that came up during the Obama administration and Robert Mueller's 10-year term was up, rather than appoint a new director, they passed a law in order for Mueller to stay 2 more years. And I wrote about it at the time that it was a misunderstanding of the need for that law. It wasn't to help get rid of a bad director. The directors can and have been fired by presidents. It's to get rid of a good director that you like, or that the public has trust in, because we saw the problems of J. Edgar Hoover having such a long career running an agency without any oversight. And the Obama administration was interesting that way, right? I mean, all of his national security officials that he brought close, John Brennan, Robert Mueller, later Jim Comey, were all people who were part of the Bush administration. So somebody who ran on the idea that he was going to bring a lot of change kept many of the same people that were unlikely to change the policies that they had been part of creating for many years. Robert Gates was another one that was brought over from Bush. But you mentioned in the book another, Leon Panetta, who was really the only outsider who came in, but he very quickly became, like so many insiders, such a defender of the turf of the CIA, rather than somebody who was looking to change the way the system worked.
Yeah, there's no question, I think, in the post 9/11 era about that fear of allowing a terrorist attack being devastating to you politically caused Obama to embrace drones, embrace surveillance. The difference being that he, in his mind or inside the administration, they felt they were following all the laws, getting the FISA court, to sign off on the surveillance. But it's, again, this kind of hyper-partisan, win-at-all-cost politics that leads Obama to be so cautious that if there is a terrorist attack, it's going to just destroy his presidency and prevent him from achieving all these domestic goals he had. So it's another way that the system doesn't work properly.
And this will just be my last question here. But one of the fascinating and troubling parts of this conversation is that we've pointed at a lot of abuses, but there are also just a lot of errors where these agencies aren't effective at identifying emerging threats and protecting us against it. And whether we're talking about the obvious ones like 9/11, but more recently the mortgage fraud crisis that almost tanked our economy, the coronavirus,
right.
Which interestingly, somebody was willing to leak that the intelligence community did brief President Trump, but why was that kept from the American people, right? There's no reason that the existence of a virus, a deadly virus that could become a pandemic, would somehow not be something that the American public deserves to hear. So if this very large apparatus that has a negative impact on our rights often, and also is not very effective in its mission, how would you feel about defund the intelligence community?
Well, there's a tremendous amount of money. There's 17 intelligence agencies, and I think Americans aren't getting what they deserve from the intelligence communities that they fund. Again, there should be members of Congress making their careers on attacking this and calling for defunding the intelligence agencies, but it's too easy for them to sort of say, I'm standing up for and defending the country. I just think that what part of the theme of the book was the politicizing of intelligence and law enforcement. So you don't tell the American public about the coronavirus warnings because that can hurt you politically. You carry out certain kinds of law enforcement investigations. You profile Muslims because that might help you politically. And that's just a dangerous trend that leads us to this moment where you have people backing police unions and being tough on crime because they can win an election, and that correctly infuriates large parts of society, particularly African Americans. You play down the coronavirus, and you have people unable to agree on whether we need to what's needed to quarantine to keep people safe. So I just fear we're in, I would just ask people, and I'll end on that, be skeptical of government officials, be skeptical of these agencies, hold them accountable, participate, read, vote, support politicians that you think are holding them accountable. I think we have to have them in some form. So be skeptical of government, but don't be cynical, and don't be apathetic, most of all. If we all just give up on this system, I just think it will allow the entrenched interests to carry out even more abuses. We all have to keep fighting in our own way for transparency and I think fact.
Well, thanks very much, David. And you've done a great service to help people understand this by writing the book, In Deep, the FBI, the CIA, and the Truth About America's Deep State. And it's certainly a contribution to what we all need to know about how these agencies can damage our democracy. We're also grateful for the partnership of the NYU Brandeis Center for collaborating on this program. I'm Mike German. Thank you for watching. I'd like to make a few notes of how we can bolster our democracy before you leave. If you haven't already, please go complete your census form online at my2020census.gov. It is quick and the most efficient way to get this census done despite the challenges of the coronavirus. Tell everyone you know to make sure they get counted in 2020. And if you can sign up to vote by mail or vote early in your state, please do so and tell all your family and friends. If you can't vote by mail and or vote early in your state, call your member of Congress and let them know you want those options to protect your vote. Thank you all for coming and supporting the work of the Brennan Center for Justice, and thanks again to David Rohde.